The agenda this week reflected on former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's legacy, heard two remarkable stories of seeking and finding refuge in Canada, and considered Black experiences of race and racism here and in the U.S. The agenda's Week in Review begins with the ever-renewable debate about electricity prices in Ontario. Great to have all of you in our studio here for a timely and relevant discussion about Ontario's electricity prices, which once again were front and center recently thanks to Prime Minister Trudeau. This may be a provincial issue, but it knows no jurisdictional boundaries. Town Hall, Peterborough, Ontario, somebody took on the PM. Roll it, please.
I feel like you have failed me, and I'm asking you here today to fix that. Something's wrong now, Mr. Trudeau. My heat and hydro now cost me more than my mortgage. I now not only work 75 hours a week, I stay and work 15 hours a day, just so I don't lose my home.
Let us now share some numbers that a November poll conducted by Nanos Research found, and these are unprompted responses, and you would not have seen this a decade ago. Hydro rates, the number one important provincial issue of concern for 1 out of every 5 Ontarians, ahead of healthcare, ahead of jobs in the economy, ahead of taxation, education, and the list goes on. Sarah, to you first. How much of a struggle, based on your knowledge, is it truly for Ontarians as it relates to the cost of electricity these days?
I think Ontarians are feeling the squeeze. I think, electricity rates have risen at a disproportionate rate to what most Ontarians feel is fair, and they're feeling squeezed. And I think, given the context of just overall bills increasing, hydro, really it is electricity, not just hydro, because hydro is just one form of electricity.
Yeah, we should just take 10 seconds to explain that. Hydro is just water, right?
Yeah, hydro is just water power, right? Hydro is hydro dams, and for whatever reason, and I think it's because we used to call it, Ontario Hydro, Hydro One, Toronto Hydro. Hydro's just one form, and it's a legacy name that's left over. But what it is it's actually electricity.
The cost of electricity.
The cost of electricity.
By any means necessary.
By any means necessary.
Okay.
So, but yeah, Ontarians are feeling the squeeze. They're saying we can't do this anymore.
Brady, maybe you can put this into some kind of historical perspective, because we do hear that there are a lot of people nowadays who can't pay the bill. More than ever? As many as ever? What's your sense on that?
The OEB just recently released some data, and it said it's gone up in double-digit percentages over the last couple of years of people who are in arrears or behind on their monthly hydro bill. So it's certainly become an issue. It's not just a small group of people complaining about what's happened. And that poll, that poll should be astounding if you're a politician. This is a utility. Utilities are boring. It's a topic most people don't care about. But Ontario, it's surpassed health and education, the two kind of stalwarts of government programs, as the biggest concern in Ontario. So if you were a politician, you'd look at that and you think, we really did something wrong to catapult this above all these other concerns.
We hear a new expression, actually, Steve. We hear the expression energy poverty, that there are more people than ever in it. Explain what that means, if you would, and tell us rural versus urban. Where is it worse?
Well, it would be worse. It's just worse if the rural poor have it worse than the urban poor, as grinding and undignified as urban poverty is. It's worse in rural areas. Energy poverty is this woman in Peterborough, a $1,000 electricity bill. If you're used to a $200 electricity bill, and if you're on a fixed income, if you don't have much leeway either way, then $1,000 is going to really hurt. When you wake up in the morning and it's -10 outside, you know that that's going to cost you money. You have to maintain the temperature inside your house. It's a matter literally of life and death in this part of the world. If you have to pay through the nose for something that you absolutely need and have no choice but to use, it's going to cause problems in your household budget. And that's what the woman was voicing with the Prime Minister.
Todd, first of all, thank you for making the long trek from North Bay to be with us tonight. What are your customers telling you in North Bay?
Well, the average bill for a customer in Ontario is about $140 a month. And you relate that to a cell bill or a satellite TV bill or what's your monthly natural gas bill. For customers, some customers, it is affordable. For those that are challenged, though, the bill increased significantly, say from $100 a few years ago a month to $140. I hear two things, and in my day job, we handle hundreds of customers a week that come in and pay a bill, or we talk to them on the phone. And what they tell us is two things. First of all, I can't control my bill. I've done everything I can possible in my home. I put in LED lights, I put in new thermostats, but my bill keeps going.
I conserve, I don't waste power.
I don't waste power. I'm very responsible as a user, and I can't get that bill down no matter what I do. And it's a sense of almost despair and frustration. And the other challenge we hear is nobody's listening to me. My bill's going up, I'm paying more and more, I'm mad about it, but nobody's doing anything about it. And we hear those frustrations on a daily basis.
Prime Minister Harper's time in office has elicited a lot of strong opinions, good or bad, among many Canadians. But what we found in this book is his impact on public policy isn't one thing. It's much more nuanced than his biggest supporters or most vehement detractors would like to let on. And so his record is nuanced, as is the case for many prime ministers. But I think his commitment to make policy decisions largely on the impact it may have on electoral politics, in many cases, does mean that you weren't swinging for the fences for much of that decade.
No,
you were looking for single hits.
He was a single sitter, no doubt about it.
I was really struck by the people around Harper who said he was our first baby boomer prime minister, and he was the first person who had grown up with the media is the message. That he was very sensitive to image, and he had a big say in sort of the design and look of the party too. A huge attention to marketing type details. He liked people who paid attention to those type of details. So we saw a government that introduced backdrops at events, that every marketing detail was paid attention to. And I think that was Stephen Harper. He had a keen sense of advertising and marketing. And I think some of his problems with journalists, frankly, was that he thought of journalists as tools of advertising or marketing. And so when we didn't do our jobs as good advertisers or marketers for him, he didn't see the purpose of us.
Here is some of what the Harper government did during its almost decade in office. Mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, sex crimes, crimes against children, some violent offenses, increasing penalties under the Young Offenders Act, create a federal ombudsman for victims of crime, a tougher approach to white-collar crime, eliminate entitlements for prisoners, that refers to the old age security, eliminate the faint hope clause for killers, and passed Bill C-51, the anti-terrorism law. Generally speaking, as a package, sort of looking down from 30,000 feet, as they say, what's Harper trying to say with this group of reforms?
The government had two approaches. One was to emphasize the importance of victims. The Victims Ombudsman was a new position. It was created to specifically reference the role of the victim, increase the role of the victim. In fact, when I talked to people about this, Peter MacKay said one of his proudest accomplishments as a Minister of the Crown dealing with these issues was that he increased the presence of victims, the fact they would be compensated, the fact they had more of a say at hearings, in sentencing, and this kind of thing. The other was to roll back what they called Club Fed, as you said, things like old age security benefits, or in many cases, things that prisoners would have access to in prison, the so-called lifestyle issues. And the government harped on that because it had the sense that people were angry that their tax dollars and their supporters, conservatives in particular, would be going to make life easy for prisoners. So they rolled back those things, even if some of them were rather symbolic, such as the old age security.
I do want to ask you about those supporters, because it was a constant question, I guess, to ask during the Harper decade as to whether or not he was really doing this because he firmly in his heart believed this was a more just Canada that would result at the end of the day, or whether he knew this was just the greatest red meat that his small c conservative base would eat up. Which was it?
I think it was a little of both. Like I said, I think that the Conservatives as a group, as a movement or party, have always been stronger on law and order issues in terms of where they position themselves on the political spectrum. However, it was clear that there was a market for this as well and among Conservative supporters. And it's partly explained also, as I said, by instances during the first election campaign where he was elected, but also the crime rate had ticked up slightly before that. There was the so-called year of the gun in in Toronto in 2005. These were real issues. People were concerned about that uptick in crime, violent crime, despite the fact that, in fact, since the 1990s, violent crime had actually been decreasing. But that small increase, that surge that people saw, was something that put the issues top of mind. And I think that is why the Conservatives also saw that there was a political market for it.
Stephen Harper was very hands-on in trade and investment policy, in fact, in probably an unprecedented way. I mean, in the past, prime ministers would sort of weigh in on the broad strokes and the direction of a trade and investment policy, but Stephen Harper was an economist. He really knew what was what. And people will say, you know, the bad thing about Stephen Harper is he thinks he's the smartest man in any room. The good thing about Stephen Harper is he probably was the smartest man in many rooms on trade and investment policy. So he was really hands-on. I'm not sure his officials necessarily appreciated that. I'm not sure he got the best out of his trade ministers, but he was really focused on the trade and investment policies during his time in office.
I'm sure as you watched and have watched Syria melt down over the last several years, and have considered the plight of the refugees coming out of that place. I mean, there are echoes of your own situation there to a certain extent. How do you think the world's done at dealing with that situation?
Not very well. I actually work with various human rights organizations, and at my church, for example, we have sponsored 5 families. None of them happen to be Syrian. And unlike popular belief, I mean, in Africa alone, there are about 9 million refugees. Did you know that? That's a big number. And Syria is also a big one. I work with PEN Canada. I'm on the board. And there also we help refugees. And I work with other human rights organizations. We have failed refugees.
Who's the we, Marina? I mean, Germany hasn't failed, surely.
No, Germany has not failed. And I was just recently in Europe, but I have to say that Germany is the only country that has not failed. Yes, the Scandinavian countries have done well, but I was in France, and they have not done that great. I mean, not good at all. Actually, I was shocked with the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, and with the hate that I encountered in France. It shocked me. And I have seen hate everywhere. I have seen it even in the Scandinavian countries.
How about in Canada?
Yeah, unfortunately here
You've seen hate
too.
for the refugees in Canada?
Yeah, I have seen it. I mean, Canada has done really well. And I mean, Canada has taken me. It gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. But we would be naive to say that no one in Canada is hateful toward the refugees.
Not no one, but I mean, at least as far as I can tell, the overwhelming response has been mostly positive, has it not?
It has. The thing is that with what happened in the United States with Trump, a lot of times I have learned that hate doesn't manifest itself unless it gets the opportunity. In Canada, we have been fortunate, but you know, when was it, 1939, I think, when that St. Louis that came to Canada with 1,000 refugees, and we turned them away. Yep. I mean, that sort of thing, you see it in a crisis. And right now, there is a crisis, but we have been in a bubble. It's far away. When you're in southern France, where the refugees are actually landing, that is when it hits you, that the French people in south of France are scared.
Do you think we're more sensitive to the plight of refugees worldwide today compared to, say, when you were trying to get out of Iran?
To be honest with you, I don't know. I'm not sure. Actually, I think maybe back then in some ways it was easier because there was no crisis. It was just a small number of people trickling in. So right now what I found in south of France was that people were afraid that there are so many refugees coming in, that their way of life, their laws, their religion, everything was under threat. So I can see that. We don't really have it at that scale in Canada. Like in the United States, they have it with the Mexicans. And look at the sentiment there.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I do want to ask you, this is a bit of a complicated and problematic question, but let's go for it anyway here.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, one of the lessons that's come out of the American election is that there were millions of whites in the United States who have felt that the last 25, 30 years has simply passed them by, and now they watch some of the world anyway, responding generously to refugees, and they, I guess, start to think to themselves, where was all this generosity towards us when we were losing our jobs, when we were losing our homes, when the world was passing us by?
Yeah.
Do you, I'm not sure what the right word is here, do you have sympathy for their position?
I have sympathy for everybody. I mean, if my husband were to lose his job, and if our livelihood were in danger and we couldn't pay our bills, I mean, of course I would be concerned. But this,
and maybe less generous towards refugees?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, if I have no money to feed myself, how am I going to feed the refugees? I totally understand that. At the same time, because I have lived both experiences. I have lived in Canada with not enough money to pay my bills, and I have lived with bombs falling out of the sky during the Iran-Iraq War, and I have been a political prisoner. I have perspective over both. And I say it from my heart that even if my husband were to lose his job, I mean, it would take a lot for me to say no to someone who has escaped bombs falling out of the sky, lost half of their family, and have suffered so tremendously.
Let's start from scratch here. Who was Cecilia Jane Reynolds?
She was a woman born in slavery in Kentucky. She was born into a house, she lived in a household of one of the elite families of Louisville, Kentucky, and she grew up with the children of that household. But when she was 6, she had reason to know that she was a slave, because she watched her father be dragged away in chains by the slave traders to take him to the Deep South.
When did she first try to escape?
She first tried to escape when she was 15, and she was successful.
How?
She was remarkable. She arranged her own escape. She had been in Washington, D.C. and seen coffles of slaves chained together in the very shadow of the Capitol building, and I think it shocked her. And as soon as she got back to Louisville, she went to the Underground Railroad operators who managed the routes out of the South, and they sent word to Toronto, to the African-American expatriate community here. And it was people from the Toronto Black community who came to Niagara Falls and helped her get across. Her owners had come for a vacation to Niagara Falls and brought her with them to the Cataract Hotel. And Benjamin Pollard Holmes, a waiter on one of the steamboats that operated out of the City of Toronto, it was called the City of Toronto, came and visited the hotel before she even got there to make the arrangements. And just a few days after her owners arrived on May 14th, 1846, Cecilia vanished.
Do we know how well or poorly she was treated while she was a slave?
It appears that she was treated very much as a member of the household, because she was friends from childhood with the woman to whom she had been given at the age of 14. Fanny Thurston was 14 when she received the 9-year-old Cecilia as a lady's maid. But we don't know the details, because slavery was at its heart an unwaged labor system, and it was coercive, and physical punishment was a usual part of it. But the very worst threat that could be used against an enslaved person was to sell them away from their family and all the people they loved. And that had already happened to Cecilia. Her father was gone. So she knew about slavery firsthand and in its most brutal form.
But then she made that fateful decision in Niagara Falls to cross over into Canada, and she knew that by doing that, there was every possibility she would not see mother and brother again, right?
That's
How did she
right.
reconcile that decision?
Well, she didn't. When she got to Toronto, she ended up marrying her rescuer, Benjamin Pollard Holmes, and they lived right behind Osgoode Hall, and she went and learned how to write. And as soon as she had already knew how to read, but she didn't know how to write. And once she learned to write, she wrote a letter to her former owners in Louisville, Kentucky, asking the price of her mother's liberty.
That was an astonishing thing to do. Did she not worry about writing that letter?
She sent it by way of Detroit with an anonymous, with a local minister by the name of Foote. Minister Foote, who took the letter for her and sent it on to her so that her owners would not know her exact location. But later on, the series of letters that ensued between her and her former mistress, Fanny, were all sent to Toronto and to other locations where Cecilia was located. So I think that she felt that she was pretty safe in Canada.
Did she have any reason to believe that if her location were established, that her former family would try to recapture her?
I'm not sure about Fanny, but Fanny's father, Charles, certainly would have. He was a hardline slaveholder.
How did you even find out about her story to begin with?
It's astonishing. This was really lucky. I was working on my previous book, I've Got a Home in Gloryland, which was about Thornton and Lucy Blackburn. And Thornton Blackburn from Louisville, Kentucky, had been owned by members of the same family that Cecilia was. So when I was in Louisville at the Filson Historical Society one time, I found 5 letters from Fanny to Cecilia. We only have one half of the correspondence, but it was part of a 20-year correspondence between those 2 women.
What a treasure trove.
Really.
Here's what writer Malcolm Gladwell, who's half Black and Canadian, and he also lives in the U.S., and had to say this about Trump recently. Let's take a look.
That process of getting woken up predates Donald Trump. I mean, I remember I had this strong feeling when people were really getting outraged about police shootings over the last 2 years. I thought this was one of the best things that had happened in this country in years, because police shootings like that have been going on for generations and nobody said anything. Finally, people were like, wait a minute, this shouldn't happen, right? And so I was so incredibly heartened by that. Finally, we're like saying, this just shouldn't go on, right? We have to, and I feel like that energy has fed into the Donald Trump election and is creating something even more significant.
Brad, I'd like to take your response for that.
I agree in some element. Malcolm X to talk about there's a time when so you need to be shaken up. So there's time to, sometimes we could be complacent. Things seem to be going okay, then something like this happens and people mobilize. As soon as you have an enemy clearly drawn in front of you, then you mobilize. Some of your enemies get this covert operation, so you don't really want to attack it. So I agree with that part. I think the part that we have to talk about in a Canadian context relating to this as well is that there's Trump and he's the president of the United States. As sick as it is for me to say that he is. Now, Barack Obama was a former president. We agree the policies are not like you said. It took a man like him to become president. Just the kind of person, the persona, his intelligence, his intellect. The problem I have when you go below Donald Trump, to the everyday person who I have to deal with in my workplace, who I got to deal with in my customer set, deal with in the store, in the retail, in everyday life. What did they think? And this is the person that could impact my ability to look after my family. This is the person that could impact my ability to be able to afford a car. They could impact all of us around this table. Whether university gets funding, what are they thinking? They're the people who support Trumpism, per se. No, Trump's a guy, right? He's a salesman. I'm working sales. If someone buys my product, great. But I need someone to buy the product when I'm selling. Why do I have customers? My biggest concern is why does he have customers?
Did you find yourself navigating yourself differently the day after the election?
Well, the day after Barack Obama won re-election versus the day after Trump won. The day after Barack Obama won re-election, I was up late. Those people on my Facebook know I'm a political junkie, so I was breaking down exit polls like 3 o'clock in the morning. I had a meeting at 9, and I went to a business meeting, and it was 2 white gentlemen and a black gentleman who was a junior analyst in the room. And I said, whoa, that was a long night last night. And the 2 white guys said, that was a terrible night last night. And I'm happy Obama beat Mitt Romney. And the black guy and I kind of looked at each other across the table and kind of looked like, yeah, we won. And these guys were miserable. So I just kind of played it cool and let it go. The day after Trump won, I also had another business meeting, and I saw glee. I saw like, well, this change. No, things are terrible. And I spoke up this time. And I said this time 8 years ago, what was the situation? Because a lot of Canadian companies were also feeling the brunt of the economic crisis in the US. And then they got quiet, and then they changed the topic and got back to business. No, so again, it's that mentality that I support Trump. I like the fact that he won, but how dare you, black guy, come in here and try to engage me in an intellectual conversation and challenge me? It's almost the same way Barack Obama was treated. And I think, my parents, the baby boomers, the blacks who came here from Jamaica, Trinidad, the islands, and South Africa in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of them are looking now saying that if they could talk that way about a black president, how are they talking about you at work? How are they talking about you when they're marking your paper? How are they talking to our black kids in school? And I think that's the context that really concerns me. And in this country, we're going to start having some real talk about that. Because this country, we talk about race, you're called the racist in this country. So in this country here, we can talk about Trump and how bad he is all we want. The question is, who are his customers and why? And how much power do those customers have to impact our lives in a negative way?
I want to bring in a historical context about the relationship between Black people in Canada and the U.S., but I would like to play you a clip with an interview that we did with David Austin, author of Fear of a Black Nation. Let's take a look.
Canada is also part of the complex of the Americas, and I think that's also important too, because when we think about Quebec and Montreal, right, New France, which is, which kind of morphed into Quebec, was really a territory that expanded from northern Quebec all the way down the Mississippi River, right? So we're talking about a vast territory going all the way down to Louisiana. So many of the same conceptions of race and identity and what it meant to be Black that operated in the United States also operated in Canada. And I think if we kind of break out of those national boundaries and those national narratives that kind of contain our understanding of who is Canadian, who is North American, who is part of the Americas, then we begin to see how some of the kind of cultural and social reference points that shape our understandings of race and identity also play out in the Canadian context too.
Ronaldo, I wanted to come to you. Historically, to what extent have race relations in the U.S. affected us here in Canada?
Well, I think historically there's always a link. And so I want to go back to the Gladwell piece because I think folks like Gladwell distort the situation.
How?
They distort the situation because they fail to recognize that Black people have been organizing on the ground well before Black Lives Matter comes into being, so to speak, with the shock of Trayvon Martin and then Michael Brown. So, they've been ongoing organizing in Black communities against police violence across the U.S. and in Canada for a long time. It's almost an unbroken kind of organizing. We're always having to push back against police violence. And so what David Austin is pointing to is, in fact, that long history that brings us to this particular moment where we can see that some of what happens in the U.S., it might be much more vulgar in its representation and its practices, but those same practices happen here. That's why I began by talking about, crosses being burned on people's lawns in Nova Scotia in 2014. We can talk about Nancy Algie at the York School Board and so on. All of these ways in which Black people's lives are dismissed, diminished through forms of anti-Black racism exist both in Canada and across the U.S. border to varying and different kinds of degrees. And we fool ourselves if we think that what happens in the U.S. influences what happens here. What happens in the U.S. highlights what happens here.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety on our website, tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and thanks to our nightly Twitter live stream on our Periscope page at periscope.tv/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.